Deep in the forests of Jasper Hollow, an abandoned cabin stood in silence. Inside, two officers were still trapped, tied back to back, their voices swallowed by smoke. No sirens, no rescue, only the crackle of burning wood and a whisper over the radio. No bodies, no problem. A mile away, a man in his 50s limped through the trees, a scarred German shepherd named Max at his side. He wasn't a hero, just a veteran who had seen too many nights like this. But when Max stopped, nose lifted to the wind, a low growl rumbling in his chest, something inside the man stirred again. From that moment on, he and his old friend uncovered a web of corruption that had festered in the shadows for years. They once called him the man who never flinched under fire. Now his hands trembled as he reached for the rifle he'd sworn never to touch again. Because this time, the war wasn't across the ocean. It was here, in the woods behind his own home. Before we begin, take a deep breath. Hit like, share this story, and subscribe, because what happens next will remind you. Not all heroes wear badges. And tell me, where in the world are you watching from? I truly want to know how far this story can travel. Jasper Hollow was the kind of town that slept early and dreamed in silence. By late afternoon, the streets emptied until only the groan of an old diner sign remained, its neon flickering like a weak heartbeat against the coming dusk. Far beyond that last streetlight, the forest began. A vast stretch of pine and wind that swallowed noise, promise, and sometimes people. That was where Raymond chose to live. 55, tall but built from the kind of endurance that never made headlines. He moved through the trees as if they were old comrades. His coat, dark brown, frayed at the cuffs, brushed against the low branches, scattering pine needles in his wake. A walking stick tapped softly beside him, its rhythm even, the way soldiers march when no one's watching. And at his heel, like a shadow made of loyalty, padded Max, a 9-year-old German shepherd, thick-coated, steady, his black muzzle silvered from years and wind. Raymond paused where the ridge curved downward. The day was fading, and the forest had that pale stillness that always reminded him of the waiting before artillery fire. He didn't like remembering, but memory had its own way of walking beside him, uninvited and persistent. The smell of sap, the angle of light, even the way the wind bent through branches could bring it back. He knelt, brushing his hand across the soil, cool, damp, familiar. "Easy trail today, boy," he murmured. Max gave no sound, just that slow, deliberate glance upward, a soldier's acknowledgement. It had been nearly 10 years since Raymond left the service. The war was long over, but it had a habit of following him home. In the twitch of a hand, the echo of sudden noise, the guilt that never aged. Max was the only part of that life he'd kept. They'd met in the desert, 2 years into a deployment neither of them were expected to survive. Max had pulled a wounded corporal from under a collapsed wall. Raymond had refused to leave the dog behind when the unit returned. "We both earned our quiet," he used to say. The forest had become their truce. Every day they walked its miles, Raymond listening more than speaking, Max leading with a sense that bordered on knowing. It wasn't peace, but it was close enough. Until that afternoon. It started with the smell. Subtle at first, drifting low through the pines. Raymond stopped. The air carried a hint of something sharp, foreign, not the soft burn of wood smoke, but something heavier, metallic, laced with oil. He lifted his head, inhaled, and the muscles in his jaw tensed. Max stiffened too, ears pointing east. Raymond crouched, pressed his palm to the ground, The soil was warm, too warm. He rubbed his fingers together and found them dusted with gray. Ash. Fresh. The veteran's heartbeat slowed, not from calm, but from calculation. He'd been here before, not this forest, but this feeling. The space between silence and danger. He scanned the slope below, eyes tracing every break in shadow. Nothing. No campers, no hunters, just a faint haze twisting upward through the trees. Then came the voice. "Burn it all. They'll never see the sunrise." The words slid between the pines, thick with alcohol and authority. Raymond froze, every instinct sharpening. It wasn't the tone of a drunk lost in the woods. It was command. The kind that carried confidence. Max's hackles lifted. The dog gave a low growl, almost a vibration against the ground. Raymond raised a hand, not to silence but to steady him. He leaned against a tree, listening. A second voice answered, muffled by distance then laughter, short, cruel, the kind that didn't sound human anymore. Raymond's fingers curled around his walking stick. He peered toward the source, but dusk had already started to bleed through the canopy, painting everything in bronze and shadow. He could see only shapes now, uneven, moving, indistinct. He whispered to Max, "Stay close." They moved downhill, slow and silent. The forest thickened, the air heavier with each step. The only sound was the soft shift of paws on damp earth. Raymond's eyes darted across every line of light and darkness, mind replaying old drills, distance, cover, retreat paths. But this wasn't war. This was home. Or it had been. A sound cracked through the quiet, not loud, but wrong. A metallic clang. Then a man's voice, angry and slurred, arguing with someone unseen. Raymond stopped behind a fallen log. The smell of fuel was stronger now. Gasoline. His stomach tightened. He reached into his coat, pulling a small flashlight no bigger than his thumb. He didn't turn it on. Habit. You never announce light until you understand the dark. For a long moment, there was nothing, just the forest breathing. Then came another sound. Something dragged across the ground, heavy, reluctant. A muttered curse. Then silence again. Raymond pressed his hand against Max's neck. The dog was trembling, but not from fear. He was ready, muscles coiled, eyes trained forward. Raymond exhaled through his nose. Not yet. The minutes stretched thin. He waited for footsteps, for a laugh, for anything human. Instead, the forest offered only quiet, the heavy, waiting kind. The kind that made the hair rise on the back of your neck. He thought, for a brief second, about turning back, calling Sheriff Briggs, his only friend still in uniform. But he didn't. Something in his gut told him that by the time help arrived, whatever was happening here would already be over. A gust of wind pushed through the trees, and with it, a flurry of ash. Tiny, glowing fragments lifted from somewhere unseen. Raymond caught one on his sleeve, faintly warm, gray-white, no bigger than a coin. That meant fire, but not a wildfire. This was local, controlled. Someone had started it. He felt the memory return again. The flash, the screams, the impossible brightness of nights when everything burned. For a moment, the forest wasn't a forest. It was the desert again, and the smoke smelled like loss. He blinked hard, grounding himself in the sound of Max's breathing. Then came the cough. It was faint, human, carried upward through the hollow below. Not the loud, harsh cough of sickness, but the desperate kind that fought for air through smoke. Raymond froze. The cough came again, softer, almost swallowed by the wind. Max looked up at him, ears forward, tail still. They both knew that sound. It was the sound of someone dying and trying not to. Raymond's mind raced. The voices had gone quiet. Whoever was down there, they weren't alone. He stepped back against the tree, keeping low. His heartbeat matched the forest's pulse, a low, relentless rhythm. He scanned the tree line one last time. Far off, through the haze, a faint orange flicker trembled. Not a campfire. Too low, too bright. Controlled flame. The veteran swallowed. His hand tightened around the stick until the wood creaked. Max pressed against his leg, whining low, urging forward. Raymond's eyes narrowed. Wait. His voice was a whisper, but the tone had changed. Not caution anymore, but recognition. He'd seen this before. The way a quiet moment sits before everything unravels. He crouched, feeling the dirt again, tracing the edge of a boot print nearly washed away by ash. It was fresh, larger than his own, the tread military. Whoever was here knew the terrain, and they weren't camping. Raymond exhaled. His breath came out as smoke in the cooling air. The night had begun. Somewhere below, another cough rose, weaker, then gone. The veteran stood still as stone. His gaze drifted toward the unseen hollow, where the forest had begun to glow faintly from within, like something breathing fire. He whispered, almost to himself, "Someone's down there." Max turned his head toward the same direction, body trembling with readiness. The forest was utterly still, waiting. The wind shifted again, carrying the smell of burning fabric, and for the first time in a long while, Raymond felt that old pull he thought he'd buried. The instinct to run toward the danger, not away from it. He looked down at Max, their eyes meeting through the dim light. The dog's pupils gleamed like embered glass. No words were needed. They began to move, slowly, quietly, toward the hollow. And just before the forest swallowed them whole, another sound broke the silence. Faint, muffled, unmistakably human. A plea hidden inside a cough. The kind of sound that tells a soldier, "This is where the story begins." Night had thickened around the ridge, swallowing sound and shape alike. The forest no longer breathed. It held its breath. Raymond and Max moved through the undergrowth, as though time itself had slowed for them. One man, one dog, bound by instinct older than reason. Each step pressed the damp soil, leaving no print, only intent. Ahead, through the thinning trees, a faint glow trembled, yellow and uneven, like a lantern set too close to sin. The cabin emerged out of the dark, like a wound that refused to heal. Its roof sagged to one side, shingles peeling like old bark, and the walls were blackened with the ghosts of fires long past. A broken chimney tilted against the moonlight. From its gaps, smoke leaked again, thin, pale, the smell sharp with gasoline. Raymond dropped to a knee behind a patch of wild brush. The cold bit through his jeans, but he barely noticed. He lifted the small binoculars from his pack, the metal cold against his brow. Inside, a flicker of movement, then another. Two shapes slumped on the cabin floor, bound back to back with rope that caught the light. A man and a woman, both in uniform. Both are still breathing. Police. He exhaled, slow, steady, fighting the rush of adrenaline that clawed up his spine. The woman's shoulder twitched, trying to shift under the ropes. Her hair, dark, streaked with blood, clung to her cheek. The man beside her tried to move, but could barely lift his head. Their lips were taped. Raymond watched the rise and fall of their chests, fragile but alive. Beside him, Max crouched low, his body coiled like a spring. The dog's breath came in slow clouds that vanished into the dark. His eyes never left the door. He could smell the fear inside, the sharp tang of panic mixed with smoke and sweat. Then came the voice, deep, sharp, soaked in rage. "You think they'll come for you? Nobody's coming." It echoed off the cracked walls, as uneven as the firelight. Raymond adjusted the focus. Inside, a tall, wiry man paced back and forth. His face was narrow, eyes sunk deep under a mess of blonde hair. A weak stubble shadowed his jaw. His flannel shirt hung open, dark with sweat and alcohol, and the way he moved, fast, restless, always glancing toward the window, spoke of someone cornered, but dangerous. On the table behind him sat a gas can, half empty, and a box of matches. Raymond's jaw tightened until it hurt. He'd seen this rhythm before. Not the man, but the violence. The pacing, the muttering, the ritual before the cruelty. He'd seen it in war zones where desperation turned men into monsters. The kind that no longer wanted victory, only fire. He swept his gaze around the clearing, calculating. The cabin sat in a hollow, half shielded by pines. One old truck rested beside it, the tires buried in mud, one headlight still faintly reflecting moonlight. Only one exit, the front door. Windows are too narrow to crawl through. One chance if it came to that. A soft metallic clang broke his focus. Metal striking wood. Inside, one of the captives had shifted, knocking over a crate near their feet. The pacing man spun on his heel, eyes blazing. His voice cracked the air. "Did I say you could move?" He crossed the room in 2 strides and kicked the man on the floor. The sound, flesh meeting boot, echoed like a gunshot through the trees. The woman gasped through the tape, twisting her face away as the man groaned, head dropping forward. Raymond's hand clenched around the binoculars until his knuckles turned white. Max made a sound, a low, guttural whine that trembled like a wire. The dog's muscles shifted, ready to break the distance between waiting and action. Raymond reached out, pressing his trembling hand against Max's neck. "Not yet, boy," he whispered, voice cracking like old timber. But even as he said it, his own pulse betrayed him. Too fast, too human. Inside the cabin, the captor crouched before his victims, breathing heavily, words spilling in fragments. "You all think you're the law, always were, but out here, the law's whoever holds the match." He lifted the gas can, tilting it slightly, watching the liquid inside slosh with cold promise. Raymond's mind raced, not in panic, but in calculation. He could cross the clearing in 20 seconds, less if the door gave way easily. But there was no cover. One wrong sound, and he'd light the fire early. He scanned the edges of the scene again, noticing details like a soldier reading terrain. The man's boots, military surplus. The belt, thick leather, carrying something metallic. The smell, not just alcohol, but diesel. Whoever this was, he'd planned something more than drunken rage. The silence stretched. Inside, the captive woman's eyes fluttered open fully now. Pale green, wide with fear and disbelief. Raymond could almost hear her heartbeat through the glass. Her gaze flicked toward the window, toward where the forest hid him. Maybe she saw something move. A reflection of Max's fur, a whisper of breath. Because she froze, lips parting behind the tape. The captor noticed. He turned toward the window, squinting. Raymond ducked down, pressing his shoulder against the earth, holding his breath until the ringing in his ears stopped. A heartbeat passed, then another. The man cursed softly, turned away. He grabbed the gas can, setting it on the table beside the matches. His hands shook now, not with fear, but with feverish energy. "They'll all learn," he muttered, "just like before." Raymond frowned. Before. The word echoed wrong. He knew the sound of guilt when it spoke through a man. He shifted his binoculars again, zooming closer to the man's belt, a faint glint catching the firelight. Max nudged his arm, impatient, almost growling. Raymond brushed his muzzle gently. "Easy, partner," he murmured. "We're close." The wind shifted, carrying the smell of burnt plastic and sweat toward him. It reminded Raymond of a barracks tent long ago, after an ambush, after the flames. He shook the memory away. Focus, present, 2 lives, 1 threat. Inside, the man grabbed the female officer by the chin, forcing her to face him. "Where's your radio, sweetheart?" he hissed. She struggled, trying to shake her head. The man laughed, the sound fractured. He slammed her back, nearly toppling the chair she and her partner were bound to. Raymond's vision blurred with rage. He wanted to move. Every part of him screamed to move. But he stayed still. His hand brushed Max's collar. The dog's tail was rigid, his breathing shallow. He was waiting for one word that hadn't come yet. The captor stepped back, pacing again. "You don't get it, do you?" he muttered. "Nobody's innocent here. Not the sheriff, not you, not me." His voice dropped lower. "They left me out there to burn. You all did." Raymond's heart stilled. That tone, the edge between pain and fury, was something he knew too well. Whoever this man was, he wasn't just cruel. He was broken. Another thud echoed. The man officer trying to shift again, maybe to protect the woman. The captor turned and struck him across the face with the back of his hand. Blood hit the floor. Raymond shut his eyes, forcing a breath. He couldn't wait much longer. The gas can was open now. The matches were close. One spark, and the whole cabin would become a tomb. And then, the moment hung. The captor leaned down, dragging his sleeve across his mouth. The firelight glinted against something on his belt. Raymond froze. He adjusted the binoculars, zooming closer until the shape came into focus. A metal badge. Not a keepsake. Not a stolen relic. A badge still polished enough to catch the flame's reflection. A deputy's badge. The realization hit him harder than any blast he'd survived. The man inside wasn't just a criminal. He was one of them. Raymond lowered the binoculars slowly, breath shallow, the sound of his own heartbeat loud in his ears. Max turned toward him, as if sensing the change in the air, the betrayal thick enough to taste. The wind outside shifted again, carrying the faint echo of a match being struck. The forest held its breath long after Raymond left the hollow. The storm had followed him home, pressing against the mountains like a living thing. By the time he reached his cabin, the first drops had begun to fall. Slow, deliberate, the kind that test the roof before they break into rain. Inside, the air was thick with the smell of pine oil and old metal. The cabin wasn't much, but it was steady. 4 walls that had kept out more than weather. On the table, an oil lamp burned low, the flame trembling in its glass as if it, too, feared the night. Raymond placed a small recorder beside it. The device was scuffed and dented, its label half-peeled, a leftover from years when he still trusted orders. He rewound the tape, pressed play, and let the forest's silence fill with a man's voice, a voice he'd hoped never to hear again. No bodies, no problem. It came through the static with a kind of casual cruelty, like someone whistling at the edge of a grave. Raymond closed his eyes. The words weren't new. The tone wasn't new. Only the time and place had changed. He sat there for a long moment, elbows on the table, face buried in his hands. Rain tapped the window, steady and patient, like a question waiting to be answered. Max paced by the door, restless. The dog didn't like storms, not because of thunder, but because thunder reminded him of gunfire. When the tape clicked off, Raymond lifted his head. He didn't curse, didn't sigh. He simply reached for the old radio on the counter, the one he'd rebuilt with spare wires and stubborn faith. The knobs were stiff. The static hissed and coughed like an old wound reopening. He adjusted the frequency until a faint pulse of connection came through. The voice that answered was low and tired. A man who had seen too much to be surprised anymore. Sheriff Walt Briggs. They hadn't spoken in years, but in towns like Jasper Hollow, silence had its own way of keeping people close. Raymond didn't explain how he'd found the recording. He didn't need to. Some things didn't require proof, only a shared history of pain. Briggs had been a medic in the war, patching soldiers while Raymond dragged the wounded through dust and fire. Both had carried too many home, and too few made it. That kind of knowing never fades. The sheriff's reply came slow, heavy with the weight of recognition. A name was spoken, Marcus Hale, one of Briggs's men, a man who'd once sworn to protect the town, now turned ghost and traitor. The rain outside deepened. Lightning split the sky over the ridge, throwing the trees into sharp relief, thousands of thin black spears swaying in the wind. The sound of it filled the room, a dull, steady roar that pressed against the walls like guilt trying to get in. Raymond stared at the recorder again. The red light blinked faintly, rhythmic like a dying heartbeat. He wondered how many lies it would take to bury one truth, and how many men it would cost to dig it back up. He rose from his chair and moved through the cabin, gathering the same tools he'd once sworn never to touch again. A flashlight, a revolver, a knife, a battered field radio wrapped in cloth. Each item had a story, and each story had a name. He packed them carefully, like folding ghosts into a bag. Max followed him silently. The dog understood ritual, the way the air changes when a man decides to step back into his old skin. His fur was damp from the mist, his eyes bright and questioning. Raymond paused to rest a hand on his head. "Easy, partner," he murmured, though his tone was less command than apology. He turned back to the table. The recorder still sat there, small and patient. He picked it up, clipped it to his belt. The voice it carried had changed everything. Briggs had told him where to meet. Near the old fire lookout tower, North Trail. No backup, no radio chatter. Only shadows. It was the kind of plan men used when they didn't trust the walls around them anymore. Thunder rolled again, closer this time, echoing through the floorboards. The lamp flickered, then steadied. For a moment, the cabin seemed to breathe. Raymond glanced at the photograph tacked above the mantel, a younger version of himself, standing beside men long buried. None of them had died clean. He should have felt anger. Instead, he felt that old, hollow calm, the one that comes before duty, the one that made men walk into storms because someone had to. He fastened his coat, checked his revolver, and stood by the door. Max was already waiting, muscles tight, tail low. The veteran reached for the lantern and blew it out. Darkness fell in an instant, soft but total, wrapping the cabin in silence. He opened the door. The storm had found them. Rain swept across the clearing, silver and cold, hissing against the roof. The wind pulled through the trees in ragged breaths. Raymond stepped onto the porch, the boards creaking under his weight. His boots sank into mud that smelled of iron and pine. He paused. The forest was alive again, but not in the way it should be. The sound wasn't natural. It had rhythm, a mechanical pulse that didn't belong to the rain or wind. Max froze beside him, hackles raised. His body went rigid, nose pointed toward the trees. Raymond followed the line of his gaze, across the wet grass, through the thin veil of rain, into the darkness between two leaning pines. At first he saw nothing. Then it appeared, a small red light, pulsing faintly through the storm. Too even to be random, too slow to be a chance. It wasn't lightning. It wasn't a reflection. It was a lens, watching. The air seemed to tighten around him. The wind carried the faint scent of metal and plastic. Cold, sterile, deliberate. A hidden camera. Someone had been watching. Max gave a low growl, a sound pulled from deep in his chest. The kind of sound that made even the night hesitate. Raymond didn't move. He didn't speak. He just stared into that flickering red eye, feeling the weight of every unspoken question gather in his throat. Who was watching? How long had they been there? How far did the rot go? Lightning flared, white and violent, and for an instant he thought he saw movement, the outline of a figure slipping back into the dark. Then it was gone. Only the blinking remained, patient and cruel. The storm came down in sheets now, drowning out everything else. Raymond reached for Max's collar, his voice steady but quiet. "Stay close." The dog pressed to his side, tense but ready. Together they stood at the threshold, framed by rain and silence. The forest stretched before them like a wound that would not close. And through it all, that red light kept blinking, constant, watchful, waiting. It wasn't thunder that made Raymond's heart quicken. It was recognition. Someone out there already knew what he'd heard tonight, and they wanted him to know they knew. The veteran closed the door behind him, the sound lost in the storm. The last of daylight died behind the ridgeline, leaving the forest wrapped in bruised violet shadow. Raymond moved through the undergrowth like a memory returning to the world. Slow, deliberate, unshakable. Beside him, Sheriff Walt Briggs kept low, his breath measured, the brim of his hat cutting a hard line against the fading sky. Max led the way, his sable coat nearly blending into the dusk, paws soundless over the pine needles. The air smelled of sap and iron and something older, the quiet watch of 1,000 unseen eyes. They said the forest held its breath at night, but tonight it felt alive. Each whisper of wind was too intentional, each creak of branch too aware. When they reached the ridge overlook, Raymond dropped to one knee, scanning the clearing below. The cabin sat there, half collapsed, its walls blackened like ribs around an open wound. The twilight made its windows glimmer faintly, reflecting the dying sky like hollow eyes. Somewhere beneath that stillness, men were waiting. Briggs crouched beside him, his revolver low, the old scar across his jaw catching the last thread of light. He had the look of someone who'd spent a lifetime learning what silence could hide. Raymond lifted his binoculars and swept the area. Nothing moved until a faint metallic flicker caught his eye halfway down the slope. He inched forward, brush scraping his sleeves, and saw it. A tiny surveillance node wedged into the cedar bark, blinking red every few seconds like a heartbeat. It wasn't police issue. Too advanced, too clean. "They're expecting company," Briggs muttered, voice low as gravel. Raymond said nothing, only traced the air with his finger, mapping an invisible grid, coverage zones, blind spots, camera arcs. This was no random ambush. Someone had drawn the lines long before they ever arrived. He pulled a folded scrap of paper from his jacket. Not a real map, just a memory scrawled from old patrols, a time when this ridge had been used for training search teams. There was a narrow path behind the cabin, following the natural dip of the hill, one that cameras couldn't easily see. North Slope, Raymond murmured. Briggs nodded once, the kind of silent understanding shared by men who had once relied on gestures to survive. Max sniffed the air, his ears twitching at the hum of insects and the far-off rhythm of water dripping from moss. His tail rose slightly, alert, not afraid. Raymond touched the dog's shoulder, feeling the pulse beneath fur, and the two began to move. The trail was tight, choked with roots that rose like bones through the earth. Ferns brushed against their knees, and somewhere behind them, the forest closed again, sealing off sound, light, and escape. Halfway down, thunder murmured beyond the mountains, low and distant, like a warning. The air thickened with moisture. Each step left darker prints on the soil. Briggs's boots made soft indentations that filled instantly with dew. You ever get the feeling," Briggs whispered, "that the woods ain't watching us? They're waiting for something?" Raymond didn't answer. He didn't have to. Both men knew the feeling too well. The calm before the world decided who would live through the next hour. Then came the voices. Two men, not far, rough and careless. The sound of boots scuffing dirt, the crack of a branch. Raymond froze behind a boulder, signaling Briggs to stay low. Max crouched between them, chest still, eyes locked. "Lighting it by 10, one voice said. The other man laughed, a sharp, uneven sound. "Boss says Hale's got it covered. We just make sure no one plays the hero." Raymond's hand tightened around the binoculars, though he didn't need them to see anymore. The proof wasn't in the badge or the voice. It was in the ease of cruelty, the casual tone of men who'd forgotten what human life meant. Briggs's expression shifted, not shock, but the kind of quiet that comes from something breaking inside. He stared down at the ground, jaw trembling once, then still. "Marcus Hale," he breathed, though it came out more as a confession than a name. "I trained him." Lightning flashed faintly to the north, throwing silver across the trees. For a heartbeat, they could see the outline of the guards, one limping, the other leaning on his rifle. Just men, but somehow heavier, weighted by what they'd already done. Briggs exhaled, his hand trembling before it steadied around the grip of his revolver. "No medal ever fixes this," he muttered. Raymond studied his friend, saw the years of service written in his posture, the stoop of someone carrying ghosts that never leave. Then his gaze shifted to Max. The dog had moved ahead, nose to the wind, tail stiff, head low. A single growl rolled through his throat, almost soundless, but enough. Raymond's breath caught. He knew that sound. The faint, acrid scent of gasoline hung in the air. Not strong yet, but spreading, carried on the damp breeze. Max's paw pressed against the soil, then lifted again, as if unwilling to touch the ground that was about to burn. Briggs met Raymond's eyes. No words, only the understanding of two soldiers who had seen what fire does when men use it for silence. Raymond's pulse quickened. He scanned the cabin, the windows, the seams of the walls. A faint shimmer flickered inside. Light, movement, reflection. Then came the unmistakable pop of a match struck against wood, small but merciless. The world held still for a single second. A breath, a prayer, a plea. Then the wind shifted. carrying the scent stronger, unmistakable now. Burning fuel. Max barked once, sharp and warning, the sound splitting the forest stillness like a bullet. Raymond's heart slammed against his ribs. He turned to Briggs, eyes steady, voice barely more than a breath. It's already started. And in that moment, as the first orange glow crawled up the broken wall of the cabin, it was no longer the forest that watched them. It was the fire. The fire had already found its rhythm, a living, breathing thing that sang through the forest in a fevered hum. Flames crawled up the cabin walls, licking the windows until glass ran like tears. The night pulsed orange and black, the air thick with smoke and ash. Raymond could feel the heat through the soil beneath his boots, the ground trembling like it remembered war. Beside him, Briggs steadied his revolver, jaw clenched, his eyes reflecting the inferno ahead. Inside, muffled voices struggled against the roar. Two officers, bound and fading, fighting to stay awake. The woman's cough cut through the chaos first. Hoarse, stubborn, alive. Grant Whitford and Lena Hart. Raymond would learn their names later, but in that moment, they were simply the reason he had to keep moving. The cabin creaked like an old lung giving out, smoke curling from every seam. From the distance came engines. Headlights streaked through the trees, too steady for panicked drivers. Raymond raised his binoculars, then froze. Armed men moved into the clearing, their uniforms a patchwork of police blues and desert camo, their formation too precise for amateurs. At the center of it all stood Marcus Hale. Hale was younger than Briggs, but carried the same soldier's weight. Tall, gaunt, eyes restless, his badge glinted faintly beneath the strobe of the fire. He shouted orders over the crackle, voice sharp and desperate. "Nobody gets out! Light the north side!" Behind him, his men spread out, shadows moving like ghosts around the burning ribs of the cabin. Briggs took cover behind a fallen pine, gesturing Raymond closer. He brought half the damn county with him, he muttered. Raymond didn't answer. His focus was on Max. The dog crouched low, muscles coiled, eyes locked on the movement ahead. When the first gunshot tore through the bark, Max didn't flinch. He darted forward, weaving between trunks, drawing fire, forcing Hale's men to aim where shadows moved faster than bullets. Raymond exhaled once, the kind of breath soldiers take before they stop being men and become instinct. He fired twice, the shots cracking like punctuation in a sentence written by chaos. One man fell. Briggs covered him, the flash from his revolver carving brief holes of daylight into the dark. Bark splintered, dirt leapt, every sound folded into one relentless rhythm. The thud of hearts, the hiss of heat, the metallic echo of justice trying to breathe. Then, more headlights. A low rumble rolled from the south road, the sound of trucks heavy with men who knew what war felt like. The first vehicle broke through the smoke, a tan pickup bearing the faded emblem of a shepherd's crook. Raymond's chest tightened. He knew that mark, Shepherd's network. Out stepped the forgotten few, veterans like him, faces carved by years and silence, old rifles, scars, steady hands. Briggs let out a sound that was half laugh, half disbelief. "Didn't think they'd still answer the call," he whispered. "They always do," Raymond said. The fight turned. Shots echoed, returned, silenced. Hale's men faltered, some dropping weapons, others disappearing into the trees. Briggs moved like he had 30 years ago, fast, sure, merciless but clean. The forest glowed brighter as the fire found oxygen. Every breath burned. In the glare, Hale stood exposed, weapon trembling in his hand. The mask of control cracked. Guilt shone through. He looked smaller now, framed by the flames he'd started. His voice broke when he spoke. "I didn't mean for it to go this far." Briggs stepped forward, revolver raised but steady. "It always goes this far," he said. Hale dropped his gun. The gesture was too late. Because behind him, the roof gave out, the sound of timber splitting under heat, the kind that drowns every word left to say. Fire poured through the cabin like breath released from hell itself. Raymond didn't think. He moved. He broke cover and ran, Max streaking past his side, their shapes swallowed by flame. Briggs shouted something, lost to the wind. The cabin door gave way under Raymond's shoulder, splinters slicing through his sleeve. The smoke hit like a wall. He coughed, choking on heat, eyes watering as the world narrowed to orange and black. Through the blur, movement, two figures on the floor, hands bound, uniforms charred. Grant tried to lift his head, but failed. Lena's eyes rolled open for half a second, unfocused, pleading. Max lunged first, the sound of his teeth against rope sharp and sure. The binding snapped. Raymond caught Lena before she collapsed, her body limp and heavy with exhaustion. "Max, out!" he rasped, voice barely there. The dog turned, guiding the way through falling embers. Raymond gripped Lena tight, pulling her toward the doorway, while Grant stumbled behind, one arm over his shoulder. The cabin screamed as another beam fell, scattering sparks like furious stars. Outside, Briggs and the veterans pushed forward through the smoke, shouting orders. "Cover the exit!" someone yelled. Then, a thunderclap. The cabin's heart imploded in a burst of white heat, flinging shards of roof and flame across the clearing. Raymond hit the ground, arms wrapped around Lena, feeling Max slam into his side. For a long second, the night was only light. When the world settled, ash drifted like snow. The fire had eaten itself into silence. Raymond rolled to his side, coughing, eyes searching through the haze. Briggs stood a few feet away, blood on his temple but standing. Behind him, the veterans of Shepard's network formed a half-circle, battered, breathing, alive. Then he saw Max. The dog lay half on his flank, fur scorched along one side, chest rising shallow but steady. His eyes found Raymond's through the smoke. Steady, calm, unafraid. Lena stirred beside them, whispering something too soft to catch. Raymond reached out, his hand finding the singed fur along Max's shoulder. Beneath the heat and soot, there was still life, a pulse strong enough to steady his own. He whispered, almost to himself, "Good boy. You brought her home." And in that moment, beneath a sky still trembling from firelight, the silence returned. Not empty this time, but full of everything they'd fought to save. Dawn came slow, as if afraid to disturb what was left of the world. Mist coiled above the blackened ruins of the cabin, curling through broken beams and shattered glass like ghosts reluctant to leave. The pine trees, their trunks scarred and smoking, stood in rows of silent witness. It wasn't the same forest anymore. Not haunted now, but hollowed, like a chest that had finally exhaled. The air smelled of wet ash and something new, something faintly alive. Raymond stood at the edge of the clearing, shoulders squared against the cold. His jacket was stiff with soot, his hands blistered. Each breath cut through his throat like the edge of a memory. But he stayed still, because standing still was the only way to feel that it was over. Behind him, the paramedics moved with quiet purpose. The rhythmic hum of generators filled the silence where gunfire had been. Grant Whitford was lifted onto a stretcher, his arm swathed in bandages, eyes fluttering open long enough to meet Raymond's. The look was dazed, wordless gratitude. Beside him, Lena Hart coughed softly under an oxygen mask, her uniform streaked with ash, her pulse visible through the thin skin of her wrist. She reached weakly for Raymond's sleeve as he passed, her voice barely a whisper. "You found us." He didn't answer, just gave a single nod, the kind that carried every word too heavy to say aloud. Max sat nearby, wrapped in a pale blanket. The side of his chest was singed, one ear nicked from flying glass. He looked smaller in the daylight, but his eyes were bright, defiant, the kind of light that refuses to go out. When Raymond knelt beside him, the German shepherd pressed his head into the veteran's palm. His tail thumped once, slow and deliberate, like the heartbeat of something stubbornly alive. Raymond murmured, "Easy, boy. We're still here." The words felt strange in his mouth. Not triumph, not relief, just truth. Across the clearing, Sheriff Walt Briggs oversaw the last of the arrests. The forest, now quiet, watched him like a cathedral of witnesses. 2 deputies escorted Marcus Hale toward a waiting cruiser. His wrists were cuffed, his badge still clipped crookedly to his chest, a glint of false honor dulled by smoke. His face had lost its hardness. What remained was the raw confusion of a man who had finally seen what his choices had cost. As he passed Briggs, he muttered, "Tell them I didn't mean to." But Briggs raised a hand. "You did," he said simply, and turned away. There was no cruelty in it, only mercy that refused to lie. Reporters arrived by noon. Their cameras whirred and clicked, lenses catching the sunlight on ash, framing the aftermath in neat, consumable rectangles. One tried to photograph Raymond as he stood near the wreckage. He turned slightly, eyes shadowed, and the reporter lowered her camera. Some stories, she understood, didn't belong to headlines. They belonged to silence. By mid-afternoon, the last of the smoke had thinned into a silver haze. The wind shifted, carrying the scent of pine sap and wet soil, life reclaiming space from ruin. Ambulances rolled away down the dirt road, their sirens faint and almost tender. A few locals came to help, a farmer offering his truck bed to carry debris, a woman from the diner handing out coffee in paper cups. No one spoke of heroism. They just nodded to Raymond and Briggs, to Max, to the forest that had burned and yet endured. At the hospital courtyard later that day, the light had softened into the gold of late autumn. Raymond and Briggs stood side by side beneath a flag barely stirring in the breeze. Their reflections shimmered in the window glass. 2 men marked by fire, but standing. "They'll rebuild it," Briggs said quietly. Raymond nodded. "Maybe. Some things shouldn't go back the same." The sheriff's lips curved in agreement. Maybe that's what healing means. A nurse approached with a clipboard, smiling as Max limped beside her, his bandage freshly changed. "He's tougher than the rest of us," she said. Max stopped, looked up at Raymond, and gave a soft chuff as if agreeing. The nurse bent down to scratch behind his ear, whispering, "They said he carried her weight out of the fire." "I believe it." Raymond smiled faintly, the kind of smile that comes when pain and pride share the same breath. When evening fell, the town gathered on the green, the open field that had seen parades, weddings, and goodbyes. Lanterns flickered in the cool dusk, strings of small lights draped between oak branches like stars caught in their own reflections. The banner stretched across the stage read in simple letters, "For courage without witness." Briggs stood at the podium, his voice steady but low. "What happened here will never make sense," he began. "But it will matter. Because some people fought when no one was watching." He paused, his gaze sweeping the crowd before resting on Raymond. "And some didn't fight alone." Raymond stepped back, shaking his head gently when Briggs beckoned him forward. "Not me," he mouthed. The sheriff smiled and gestured instead to Max. The dog hesitated at the edge of the crowd until the children started calling his name, soft at first, then louder, joy spilling into the evening air. He walked up, limping slightly, ears tilted back in embarrassment. A dozen small hands reached for him, brushing his fur, careful around the bandages. One little girl placed a paper flower on his collar. The applause that followed wasn't for victory. It was for kindness, for everything fire couldn't burn away. Briggs lowered a plaque onto the wooden stage. It was nothing ornate. Oak polished by hand, brass letters that caught the light just so. For courage without witness. As the crowd fell silent, the wind rustled through the grass like distant applause. The moment stretched, long, tender, belonging to everyone and no one. Somewhere, a church bell chimed. Later, when the gathering faded and the lanterns dimmed, Raymond and Max walked home together under a sky heavy with stars. The town was quiet again, porch lights glowing like small promises, the smell of rain clinging to the earth. They passed the old bridge, its rail still blackened from soot, and for the first time, Raymond didn't look away. Back at the cabin, the porch was half rebuilt, the wood pale and raw against the old foundation. Raymond settled into his chair, the same one he'd repaired after the war, and Max lay at his feet, head on his paws, eyes half closed. Crickets sang softly in the weeds. The forest beyond whispered again, not with fear this time, but with peace. Raymond leaned forward, elbows on his knees, watching the horizon shift from blue to silver. "We didn't save them alone, did we, boy?" he said quietly. Max's ear flicked, then his tail brushed the porch once, a single beat of acknowledgement. The veteran smiled, voice no louder than the wind. "Didn't think so." He reached down, resting his hand on Max's side, feeling the warmth of life beneath the fur. His thoughts wandered, to Briggs, to Lena and Grant recovering, to the men of Shepard's network who had come without question. To every soul that had burned once but found its way back to light. The night deepened. Fireflies drifted near the pines, glowing faintly through the mist. Somewhere far off, an owl called, and its echo folded into the hush of the valley. Raymond closed his eyes for a moment and let the quiet fill him. War takes, it always does, but mercy returns. The forest, once haunted, had finally exhaled. Sometimes courage doesn't shout. It doesn't wear medals or make headlines. It walks on four legs beside the weary or stands guard in the dark when no one's watching. It's the kind that simply stays, through smoke, through fear, through silence. And mercy isn't grand. It's the gentle hand that chooses to help, even when the world forgets to look. It's the way a heart, once broken, still makes room for kindness. Tonight, somewhere far away, someone like Raymond is still out there, mending fences, nursing scars, teaching the dawn how to begin again. And maybe a dog like Max is lying close by, breathing steady, proof that love doesn't need to be loud to last. Because the world keeps turning, not because of heroes who fight for glory, but because of the quiet ones who keep believing when the light feels far away. Sometimes, the quietest hearts carry the loudest courage. If you believe the world still holds goodness worth fighting for, subscribe and help us keep that light alive.